The helicopters appeared over the Afghan mountains without warning. Two MH-47 Chinooks from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment cut through the cold night air, flying low along the jagged ridgelines of eastern Afghanistan. The pilots were using terrain masking, keeping the aircraft hidden from anyone watching from the valley floor. At that altitude, the rotor wash barely carried beyond the rocks. Inside the aircraft sat two groups of men who had spent years preparing for nights exactly like this. On one side were operators from the United States Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Across from them were troopers from the British Special Air Service. Both units had reputations that stretched across decades of modern warfare. Both had built legends around counterterrorism missions, hostage rescues, and covert operations that rarely appeared in public records. Both believed they understood exactly how elite special operations were supposed to work. That night would quietly challenge that assumption. The mission itself was not supposed to be historic. It was a routine operation by the standards of the early war in Afghanistan. It was the winter of 2002, only months after American and coalition forces had pushed the Taliban government out of Kabul. Al-Qaeda fighters and Taliban commanders had scattered across eastern Afghanistan, many moving through the mountain networks near the Pakistani border. The valleys in Khost Province had become a corridor for fighters, weapons, and money moving between safe houses and training camps. Signals intelligence collected by the National Security Agency had begun picking up repeated satellite phone calls in the region. CIA analysts at the Counterterrorism Center linked those calls to a Taliban logistics coordinator responsible for moving foreign fighters through the mountains. He was not a battlefield commander. He did not appear in propaganda videos. But intelligence officers believed he had become one of the most important facilitators in the network rebuilding Taliban resistance. Removing him would disrupt an entire chain of movement across the eastern border. That is how the mission began. Inside Bagram Air Base, intelligence officers from Joint Special Operations Command assembled a targeting package built from intercepted communications, drone imagery, and reports from Afghan sources. An MQ-1 Predator drone confirmed activity at a small compound located in a narrow valley south of the Pakistani frontier. Several armed guards were visible. Pickup trucks moved in and out of the compound during the day. Satellite imagery suggested weapons storage inside one of the outer buildings. The target had arrived only hours earlier. JSOC authorized the raid. Delta Force would lead the assault. A small SAS element would accompany them. Joint operations between American and British Special Forces had already become common during the first phase of the war. Both countries were hunting the same networks, often sharing intelligence and operational resources. For the SAS troopers assigned to the mission, the plan appeared familiar. A helicopter insertion, a quick perimeter lockdown, an assault through the compound. Capture or eliminate the target. Extract before daylight. It was a type of raid the SAS had conducted many times before, from Northern Ireland to Iraq. Yet something about the American preparation immediately caught their attention. The Delta Force operators moved through the staging area with unusual speed. Equipment checks were completed quickly and quietly. Radios were tested. Night vision systems were calibrated. There was very little conversation. No extended briefing. No drawn-out discussion of contingencies. Every man appeared to know exactly where he would be moving once the aircraft touched down. The SAS troopers noticed something else as well. The Americans were carrying an unusually dense set of communications equipment. Several operators had additional radios mounted to their chest rigs. Others carried small digital devices connected to satellite antennas. At the time, the SAS had not yet fully integrated those kinds of real-time intelligence tools into every assault team. For Delta Force, it had already become routine. The aircraft crossed the final ridgeline just after midnight. The pilots cut their lights completely. Inside the helicopters, the only illumination came from the faint green glow of night vision goggles. The valley below appeared empty. The compound sat alone among rocky fields and narrow irrigation paths. As the Chinooks descended, the Delta Force team leader raised one hand. 5 seconds. The rear ramp dropped. Cold air rushed through the cargo bay. The aircraft barely touched the ground before the operators moved. Delta Force exited first, spreading across the landing zone with disciplined speed. The SAS troopers followed immediately behind them. Within seconds, the helicopters lifted away, disappearing back into the darkness. Silence returned to the valley. Then the Americans started moving. What happened next would leave the British observers quietly reassessing what they thought they knew about modern special operations. To understand why that night left such an impression, it helps to understand the two organizations standing in that Afghan valley. The British Special Air Service had been shaping modern special operations doctrine for more than half a century. The unit traced its roots back to the deserts of North Africa during the Second World War, when David Stirling formed a small group of commandos designed to strike behind enemy lines. Their tactics relied on surprise, speed, and small teams capable of operating far from conventional forces. Over the decades, the SAS became one of the most experienced special operations units in the world. During the 1970s and 1980s, the regiment refined modern counterterrorism tactics while confronting insurgent networks in Northern Ireland. Their hostage rescue methods later became famous after the Iranian embassy siege in London in 1980, when masked SAS troopers stormed the building and ended the crisis in less than 20 minutes. In the years that followed, SAS units deployed repeatedly to the Middle East. During the Gulf War in 1991, patrols operated deep inside Iraq, hunting Scud missile launchers, threatening Israel and coalition forces. Those operations cemented the SAS reputation for endurance and small unit independence. By the time the war in Afghanistan began in 2001, SAS soldiers had decades of operational experience across deserts, cities, and mountain terrain. The men standing beside Delta Force in that valley were veterans of Iraq, Bosnia, and previous covert operations. They understood combat. They understood special operations. And they understood that American Delta Force had originally been modeled on their own regiment. The story of Delta Force begins with a U.S. Army officer named Charles Beckwith. In the 1960s, Beckwith served an exchange tour with the SAS in Malaysia. During that time, he observed a level of small unit counterterrorism capability that the United States military did not yet possess. When Beckwith returned to the United States, he began arguing that the U.S. Army needed a similar organization. It would take more than a decade for that idea to become reality. Following a series of terrorist incidents during the 1970s, including airline hijackings and attacks against American targets overseas, the Pentagon finally authorized the creation of a dedicated counterterrorism unit. In 1977, Beckwith was given the task of building it. The new unit would be officially named the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Most people simply called it Delta Force. Early Delta training borrowed heavily from the SAS model. Beckwith had studied years earlier. Selection emphasized mental resilience, small team tactics, and precision shooting. But over time, Delta Force evolved into something slightly different. While the SAS traditionally operated as an independent special operations regiment within the British Army, Delta Force developed inside a much larger American intelligence and military ecosystem. By the early 2000s, Delta was tightly integrated with Joint Special Operations Command. JSOC functioned as a centralized command responsible for the most sensitive counterterrorism missions conducted by the United States military. Within that structure, Delta Force worked alongside other elite units, including SEAL Team 6, and specialized intelligence elements drawn from across the Department of Defense. The key difference between Delta and many other special operations units was the depth of intelligence integration surrounding each mission. Operators were not simply executing raids. They were part of a continuous intelligence cycle. Information collected during one operation could immediately feed into the planning of the next target. Signals intelligence analysts, drone operators, CIA officers, and special operations planners all worked inside the same network. The system allowed JSOC to conduct what commanders later described as relentless targeting. A raid conducted at midnight could produce intelligence that launched another mission before sunrise. By 2002, that model was still developing. The war in Afghanistan, had forced the United States to rapidly adapt its counterterrorism strategy. General Stanley McChrystal, who would later command JSOC, began pushing for tighter integration between intelligence agencies and special operations units. The objective was simple: identify enemy networks faster than they could reorganize. For Delta Force operators on the ground, that meant carrying more intelligence tools directly into combat. Satellite communication devices allowed teams to remain connected to analysts, monitoring drone feeds. Secure radios linked operators to command centers hundreds of miles away. Digital mapping systems allowed teams to track terrain and buildings in real time. The SAS had begun incorporating similar technologies, but the Americans were pushing the concept aggressively. That difference became visible during joint operations. British soldiers watching Delta teams prepare for a mission sometimes noticed how quickly American operators could receive updated intelligence just minutes before entering a target area. A new drone image, a change in vehicle movement, a confirmation that a suspect had entered a specific building. All of that information could arrive through handheld devices or secure radio channels. It meant the assault plan could change moments before the helicopters landed. For traditional special operations planning, that level of flexibility was unusual. Historically, teams rehearsed a mission carefully and executed the plan as written. Delta Force was increasingly operating inside a more fluid system. Information flowed constantly. Targets evolved. Plans adjusted in real time. That operational tempo would become one of the defining features of American counterterrorism campaigns in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The SAS soldiers preparing for the raid in Khost Province had heard about these methods. They knew JSOC had been experimenting with faster targeting cycles. But hearing about it during briefings was one thing. Watching it unfold on an actual battlefield would be something else entirely. In the valley below them, the compound lights were still visible through night vision. Armed men moved between the buildings. The Taliban facilitator believed he was safe for the night. Inside the assault teams moving toward the target, Delta Force operators were already receiving updates from surveillance aircraft overhead. The mission plan had just changed, and the raid had not even started yet. The first man through the outer wall moved with almost mechanical precision. From the SAS position covering the southern side of the compound, the British troopers watched the Delta Force assault element close the final distance. The operators advanced in short bursts across the rocky irrigation paths, moving through patches of dry grass and broken stone. Through night vision, the scene appeared in shades of green. The compound itself was simple. A cluster of low mud structures surrounded by a rough outer wall built from packed earth and stone. A small generator shed stood near the entrance gate. 2 pickup trucks were parked beside the main building. An MQ-1 Predator drone orbited high above the valley, its infrared camera feeding live imagery to analysts monitoring the raid from a command center hundreds of miles away. Every movement inside the compound was being watched. Moments before the assault began, one of those analysts transmitted a brief update. 2 additional armed men had entered the northern building. The message reached the Delta Force team leader through a secure radio mounted to his chest rig. The change was small, but it altered the assault geometry. Instead of breaching the main structure immediately, the Delta operators shifted their approach. A second assault pair peeled off toward the northern side of the compound. The SAS troopers noticed the adjustment instantly. There had been no long pause, no extended discussion. The Americans simply moved. The breach came seconds later. A suppressed rifle cracked once, eliminating the guard posted near the gate before he could react. At the same moment, a breacher placed a small explosive charge against the compound wall. The detonation was sharp but controlled, blowing a narrow entry point through the mud barrier. Delta Force operators poured through the opening. Inside the compound, the tempo accelerated. One team secured the outer courtyard, while another element moved directly toward the northern building, where the 2 armed men had been observed entering minutes earlier. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. A Taliban fighter stepped through the doorway holding an AK pattern rifle. The Delta operator at the front of the stack fired twice in rapid succession, the suppressed rounds cutting through the quiet night with short mechanical pops. The fighter collapsed before he could bring the weapon to his shoulder. Another man appeared behind him. This time, the engagement lasted slightly longer. Several shots echoed off the mud walls before the building fell silent. Outside, the SAS troopers maintained their perimeter positions, scanning the surrounding fields through night vision optics. Their job was to block any escape routes and prevent reinforcements from approaching the compound. From their vantage point, the speed of the American assault was striking. The Delta operators moved aggressively between buildings, clearing rooms with controlled bursts of fire and shouted commands. Within seconds, the courtyard had been secured. A third team advanced toward the main structure, where the intelligence suggested the target was located. Overhead, the Predator drone continued circling the valley. Its operators monitored the surrounding terrain for vehicles or armed groups approaching the compound. None appeared. Inside the main building, the Delta breacher prepared another charge. The door blew inward with a sharp flash. 2 operators entered immediately. A third covered the hallway. The interior of the structure consisted of 3 narrow rooms, connected by short corridors. Blankets hung over several doorways, dividing sleeping areas from storage spaces. One man attempted to flee through the back of the building. He was intercepted by a Delta operator covering the rear exit. The target himself was located in the final room. He was unarmed when the assault team entered. For a brief moment, he appeared frozen, as if struggling to understand how the compound had been overrun so quickly. A pair of operators forced him to the ground and secured his hands with flex cuffs. The entire assault had taken less than 4 minutes. From the moment the helicopters left the landing zone to the moment the target was captured, fewer than 10 minutes had passed. But the operation was not finished. Delta Force teams immediately began exploiting the compound for intelligence. Documents were gathered. Satellite phones were seized. One operator photographed a notebook filled with phone numbers and handwritten notes in Arabic and Pashto. Another operator removed hard drives from a small computer located near the back wall. Every item was placed into evidence bags for later analysis. The SAS troopers watched as the Americans moved through the process with the same urgency they had shown during the assault itself. There was no pause for celebration, no visible shift in tempo. The mission simply moved into its next phase. Within minutes, the first intelligence reports were already being transmitted to analysts waiting at Bagram Air Base. The captured devices would be examined immediately. Phone numbers would be cross-referenced. Call records would be compared with previous signals intercepts. The information gathered during the raid could produce new targets before the night was over. For the SAS soldiers observing the operation, that realization carried weight. In many previous conflicts, raids like this had been considered individual missions. They removed one target. Then the operation ended. What the British troopers were witnessing in Afghanistan looked different. This raid was not an isolated event. It was one link in a continuous chain of operations. Before the Chinooks even returned to pick up the assault team, intelligence officers were already building the next mission. Minutes later, the distant thump of rotor blades echoed across the valley. The extraction helicopters had arrived. Delta Force operators loaded the detainee and the captured materials into the aircraft. Within moments, the helicopters lifted away from the valley floor. The compound grew quiet again. From the outside, it appeared as though almost nothing had happened. But for the soldiers who had witnessed the raid unfold, the mission had revealed something far more significant than the capture of a single Taliban facilitator. It had demonstrated an entirely different rhythm of modern special operations warfare. And that rhythm would soon spread far beyond that valley in eastern Afghanistan. The helicopters reached Bagram Air Base shortly before dawn. Inside the cargo bay of the lead MH-47 Chinook, the detainee sat restrained on the floor between 2 Delta Force operators. Around him were several sealed bags containing documents, satellite phones, and computer equipment collected from the compound. For the Americans, the mission had already shifted to its next phase. The moment the aircraft landed, intelligence specialists were waiting on the runway. The captured materials were moved directly to a temporary exploitation center set up inside one of the base hangars. Analysts from the CIA, NSA, and JSOC began examining the contents almost immediately. Phone numbers were copied. Memory drives were scanned. Handwritten notes were translated. Within hours, new connections would begin appearing on intelligence screens. For the SAS troopers who had participated in the raid, the speed of that transition was striking. The assault had ended less than an hour earlier. Yet the information gathered during those few minutes inside the compound was already feeding into a much larger intelligence process. Later that morning, several members of the British detachment gathered inside a small briefing room on the edge of the airfield. Maps of eastern Afghanistan were pinned to the walls. Helicopter routes and infiltration zones were still marked in grease pencil across large plastic overlays. The room smelled faintly of aviation fuel drifting in from the runway. An SAS troop commander studied the map for a moment before speaking. "What they're doing," he said quietly, "is running the entire war like a targeting cycle." The comment reflected something the British soldiers had noticed throughout the mission. The Delta Force operators had not approached the raid as a single, isolated objective. From the moment intelligence identified the Taliban facilitator, the mission had been treated as one step in a larger process. The objective was not simply to capture one individual. The objective was to collapse the network around him. Every document collected during the raid was potential intelligence. Every phone call stored in the seized devices could reveal another facilitator, another courier, another safe house. Each new piece of information could generate another mission. That system would soon become the foundation of modern counterterrorism operations. Within Joint Special Operations Command, leaders such as General Stanley McChrystal began refining the process into what they described as a continuous targeting cycle. The concept was straightforward but powerful. Find the network. Fix its location using intelligence. Finish the target through a raid or strike. Exploit the information collected. Then analyze that intelligence to identify the next target. The cycle repeated again and again. During the following years in Iraq and Afghanistan, that approach would allow JSOC units to conduct raids at a pace that few adversaries could survive. Operations sometimes occurred multiple times in a single night. Targets that once took months to locate could be identified within hours. For many Allied Special Forces units, including the SAS, observing that operational model firsthand carried important implications. British commanders had long valued precision and planning in their special operations doctrine. SAS missions were typically prepared with careful attention to detail and executed with disciplined control. The American approach did not replace that philosophy, but it introduced a new dimension: speed. Delta Force operators were functioning inside an intelligence network capable of updating mission parameters in real time. Drone feeds monitored compounds moments before the assault. Signals intercepts confirmed the presence of suspects minutes before helicopters landed. Captured devices were analyzed immediately after extraction. It created a battlefield environment where information moved almost as quickly as the assault teams themselves. For the SAS troopers who had watched the raid unfold in Khost Province, the lesson was unmistakable. Modern special operations warfare was evolving. Elite units were no longer operating only as isolated strike teams. They were becoming the direct operational arm of a global intelligence system. In the months that followed, joint operations between British and American special forces continued across Afghanistan and later in Iraq. Cooperation between the units deepened as both countries pursued the same militant networks. British officers began integrating similar intelligence-driven targeting methods into their own operational planning. New technologies appeared within SAS assault teams. Additional communications systems, real-time drone surveillance, closer coordination with intelligence agencies. The evolution was gradual, but the direction was clear. By the late 2000s, the model pioneered by JSOC had influenced special operations forces across NATO. The partnership between the SAS and Delta Force remained one of the most effective examples of that cooperation. Both units retained their own traditions, training systems, and operational cultures. But they also learned from each other. And on a quiet night in eastern Afghanistan, inside a small valley where a Taliban facilitator believed he was safe, that exchange of ideas had become visible in real time. The raid itself would never appear in official history books. The compound would return to silence once the helicopters disappeared into the mountains. But for the soldiers who had been there, the mission represented something larger than the capture of a single target. It revealed how modern special operations warfare was beginning to change. And it showed how two of the world's most experienced special forces units were adapting to that change together.